Para mí, el día de hoy, presentar a nuestro primer conferencista magistral del Congreso. Se trata del Dr. Bruce Lewenstein, del departamento de Comunicación de la Universidad de Cornell, y que el día de hoy nos puede hablar de la recreación en la comunicación pública de la ciencia. Les pido por favor un aplauso para Bruce Lewenstein.
Gracias, Miguel. Hola. Voy a tratar de hablar en español por un minuto. Yo crecí en California, bueno, Alta California, no Baja, y aprendí español en la escuela secundaria. Por desgracia, he olvidado la mayor parte desde entonces. Me siento honrado de estar aquí en una reunión RedPOP y SOMEDICYT, porque he sabido de RedPOP durante muchos años y estoy muy impresionado por la vibrante y productiva de la red. Quiero dar las gracias a Miguel García y otros miembros del equipo organizador para organizar mi visita. Como he mencionado a varias personas, la primera y última vez que estuve en México fue para pasar una noche cuando tenía 4 años. Y eso es una lástima, porque es un hecho poco conocido que en realidad soy mexicano. Verás, mi padre se casaron en San Francisco en 1955. Y cerca de 2 años más tarde, mi padre tenía un viaje de negocios a la Ciudad de México y mi madre llegó. Y 9 meses después de eso yo nací. Veo esto es un público que conoce la ciencia de su biología, así que no tengo que explicar. Así que, ya ves, soy mexicano y estoy encantado de estar de vuelta en casa. Bueno, por razones de tiempo y comprensión, creo que debería volver a inglés. Gracias. So Miguel asked me to talk about the question of recreation and PCST. And of course, I almost always start out by wondering about the definitions. What is recreation? What is PCST? And while I don't want to get stuck or bogged down in the labels and the language, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there are different words and different meanings for things, even without the problem of translation between English and Spanish or other languages. In particular, I want to point to the Spanish words of apropiación social compared to divulgación, compared to the English words of popularization or PCST. And I particularly want to emphasize the social, and I'll come back to that again and again during the talk today. But let me begin by talking about what do we mean by recreation. There are some relatively standard kinds of things that get counted as recreation. Some of them are clubs and sports that people might involve with. In this case, we actually have the Club of Creative Anachronism, where they try to recreate medieval battles. People often will consider gardening as recreation. In the United States, hunting is very common. And of course, people learn things in those recreation activities. You can't see it, it's been cut off on the screen. The caption on the cartoon for hunting says, "Son, thanks to climate change, someday none of this will be yours." Collecting is also another thing that is often a recreation. That's a picture of my keychain collection. I've already bought 3 since I came to Mexico. More obviously related to learning are parts of recreation, perhaps travel, where one learns about new cultures, as we heard about in the session this morning, about the need for recognizing different cultures. Reading, something that people do for recreation, watching television or consuming other media. It's a little hard to tell on this screen, but that picture of the family watching the television, I don't know if you can see past it, but apparently they're on a house high on a hill looking out over the ocean and a beautiful beach. I'm not quite sure why they're inside watching television. The translator is here. Okay, gracias. So the kinds of things that we might include under recreation include the things I've talked about, sports and media and clubs and things like that. And then there's another category that we can call hobbies. And I want to spend some time talking about hobbies. First, there are the traditional hobbies. Hobbies are things where there's a specialized pursuit, something that goes beyond your work or your occupation. And usually hobbies involve some kind of knowledge. So some of the traditional hobbies might include things like stargazing, or amateur radio, or bird watching, or gaming. It's a more modern, I'm calling it traditional, but it's more modern. Some other traditional hobbies that involve especially science and some learning might be things like amateur rocketry and beekeeping. We have another set of hobbies that are some kind of transitional. We call them in English tinkering. I'm not sure what that would be in Spanish, but the idea of just fooling around and building things with your hands. Sometimes those things might be practical, sometimes they might be pieces of art that you're trying to get to. And then there are new hobbies. For example, the DIY bio movement, the do-it-yourself biology movement, where people are learning how to do their own DNA sequencing or genetically modifying E. coli in order to make it fluoresce, just on their own, in their garage, in their living room, in their bedroom. There's a whole movement of DIY bio, not trying to do anything productive, not trying to create jobs or products, but just for the fun of it. Similarly, there's a movement called the maker culture. I don't know, has the maker culture come to Latin America? Is this familiar? No? Okay. So this is a movement where people come together they're tinkerers, but tinkerers on a grand scale, using all kinds of new activities. It's often, again, people doing it just for recreation. They bring their families. Many in the United States, we have a movement of people who choose to educate their children at home instead of sending them to school. They often use the maker movement. They have a magazine, they have a website, they have a big annual conference, which actually just happened this past weekend near San Francisco. It's a movement, and many people in the Science Museum community in the United States are trying to figure out how they can connect with this kind of community. Something I'm calling 2.5 because it's perhaps part of the maker movement, but there's a lot of excitement about it as people who are learning to use 3D printers where they can make various kinds of objects, little guitars, little wheels, little products. Again, just as a hobby, as something to do. Of course, sometimes that can be a problem. Some of you may have heard of this story that happened a couple of weeks ago in the United States, where there's now a man released plans for how you can use these new 3D printers to build a handgun. He was asked by the United States government to take the plans down back off the internet. Of course, by then they had already spread to many sites. So, So let's think about recreation in our field of public communication, science, and technology. Because especially some kinds of recreation, and especially the hobbies, involve learning. So the question is, what do we mean by learning? We need to understand that. And in order to explain that, I want to tell you a little bit about a report that the US National Academy of Sciences put out a few years ago. I was the co-chair of this committee on learning sciences in informal environments, and I'm very glad that one of the other committee members, Cecilia Garibay, from Chicago, is here and will be a part of a panel tomorrow. That report, we said that learning in informal environments happens in 3 venues. Happens in everyday settings, people doing things with their families, at work, walking around, going for a hike, being tourists. Those are all places where learning takes place. Sometimes that learning takes place in designed spaces, places that are intended to be places of learning, like museums and zoos and aquariums and nature centers. And sometimes the learning takes place in programs, activities that are created specifically for the purposes of learning. In the United States, we looked especially at after-school programs and at senior citizen programs, because that's where we could find data. And we tried to define learning. There were 6 what we called strands of science learning. The first one we called experiencing excitement and interest and motivation. The idea that you don't learn anything until you're excited about it, until you want to learn. Some people think of that as being before learning, and we said in that committee, no, that's part of learning. And it's particularly important for those of us involved in informal science or learning science in informal environments, because that's a lot of what we do very well. The next 4 strands look like the same things that you would see if you were defining learning for a school. You learn to understand concepts and explanations and arguments related to science. The third one, you manipulate and test and explore in order to make sense of the physical world. The fourth strand, your ability to reflect on what you've learned. We know from educational and developmental psychology that that's how you learn, is by reflecting on what you've learned. The ability to participate, not just to know the methods, but to actually be able to participate in science. That's the 5th strand. And then the 6th strand, the last one, is the one that, again, goes beyond what we often think of. And this is that part of learning science is to learn that you can learn science, to develop an identity as someone who's able to learn science. Many of us in this community have, I'm sure, been to parties where you tell someone what you do, and they say, oh, that's nice. Who's playing in the football game tomorrow? And then they will say, oh, and the last time I took science was in high school, and I just barely passed. And those are people who don't think that they can learn science. And so part of learning, and what many of us are trying to do, is help people know that they can learn, have an identity as someone who can learn science. As I said, the first and the 6th strands are the ones that are special for us in the informal world. 2nd through 5th look very much like what you would see in any kind of learning situation. So where does recreation fit in this world? Well, clearly family activities. Recreation happens there, visiting museums with your family, not in school groups, but with your family. Some kinds of sporting clubs and after-school programs that are not part of the formal education system. And as I said, 2 of the strands, the one about excitement, interest, and motivation, and the one about identity as a science learner, Those are the ones that are particularly important for us if we want to understand what kind of learning takes place in recreation. So, I'm a researcher, and the question is, what do researchers know about what kind of science people learn through recreation? That was really the question that Miguel asked me to talk about, and I said I don't know, and I'll have to go look. And when I went to look, I discovered there isn't much that we know. So most of the rest of this talk is my attempt to bring together what little we do know. Really, the question of science learning as being part of recreation is not a question that's been asked before. There is a literature on leisure studies, which I'll talk about in a minute, but for the most part it has not connected to science. And the one place where there's some overlap is in the area of amateurs and hobbies, things like astronomy and bird watching and so on. So I'll spend most time there. One of the most important concepts from the leisure studies world is something called serious leisure. This is leisure that has a purpose. And three of the elements of serious leisure I think are particularly important for us if we want to think about learning science. Serious leisure is leisure where you identify with the field that you are supposedly relaxing or doing for leisure. That's clearly tied to that idea of identity. For some people, serious leisure may be connected to a career. I'm going to leave that aside. Serious leisure often involves an activity where you have a distinct set of values, a distinct ethos. Again, that sense of identity. There's often a lot of effort put into serious leisure. This is not something that people do just occasionally. It's things that people do over and over. And they have perseverance. And finally, serious leisure usually leads to some kind of personal benefits. And I think that might be tied to the motivation question, although I'm not positive. Just to give some examples of what people talk about in serious leisure, for example, they talk about reading as serious leisure, and especially they talk about some of the motivations for reading. Sometimes you read for utility, for utilitarian purposes. You're looking for instructions, you're finding information, you like to read about places. Sometimes you're reading for pleasure, to relax, maybe even to escape. And finally, sometimes you read to be fulfilled, to have a greater sense of satisfaction, to challenge yourself, to inspire yourself, or perhaps to feel as though you have improved yourself, personal development. There has been some look at the learning that takes place in gardening. And that work has has tried to identify what people learned when they gardened. The learning seems to be tied to what people bring into the situation, to their own concerns, whether those are scientific concerns or food concerns or nature concerns. Sometimes people do learn through gardening the ongoing practice of research and of turning research into larger ideas. And a significant thing that people learn when they're involved in gardening is that gardening is not a lonely thing. It is often something done as part of a broader community. Even if you garden at home, you will join a gardening club, or you will be part of a gardening community garden, or you will talk about gardening, or you will get a gardening magazine. All these things that make you part of a broader community of people. Hang on to that idea of the broader community. People do apparently change their attitudes and their appreciation for nature when they participate in gardening. Another area that's been studied is what do people learn when they engage in crafts, like making things with their hands or beading or things like that. Mostly this has been studied, actually it's only been studied once that we could find, by another colleague of ours from the US, Saul Rockman, and it was studied in the context of how people who use crafts in schools, what they learn. but we can connect some of that to what they learn if they do crafts at home. Clearly, it leads them to some better drawing skills, some better manipulation skills. It helps teach them ideas about art, design. Sometimes if they do things like mixing their own perfumes at home, they're learning some chemistry, so there's some ideas. People who do crafts are able to apply their ideas in different areas. They tend to, it reinforces their curiosity when they engage in this kind of hobby. Hobbies are good, or at least crafts are good for different learning styles, for people who learn with their hands or with their senses rather than through reading or lectures or so forth, the way I'm talking to you now. And finally, people who engage in crafts, again, there's a socialization aspect where they often talk to each other in various ways. I guess I did include one picture here. I realized I'd gone for a while without a picture. That wasn't so good. Another hobby is astronomy, stargazing, and amateur astronomers who spend a tremendous amount of time learning about the sky and about the solar system and the universe and so forth, and where in recent years there have been new kinds of activities to bring new kinds of people into the hobby of astronomy. How many of you have heard of Galaxy Zoo? A few, not many, okay, maybe 10, 20% there. The Galaxy Zoo is it's an online project. When the Hubble Space Telescope took pictures of galaxies outside our solar system, or outside our galaxy, they came up with hundreds of thousands of images. And they need to be categorized into the different kinds of galaxies, and there's 6 or 8 different kinds. And it turns out that computers don't do that very well. It turns out that they can't really see the images, and humans do it better. But a professor and 6 graduate students can't work their way through 100,000 images. So instead, what they've created is an online game where people can match different kinds of galaxies to categorize them, and through various kinds of mechanisms they can, once enough people have categorized a galaxy in a particular sort, they can say that's what it is. And people will spend hours on the site categorizing. And in fact, from Galaxy Zoo, there's now a whole bunch of other projects of this sort. If you go to zooniverse.org, you can find projects not just about astronomy, but about the oceans and about plants and animals and so forth. They have studied the motivations, that first strand of learning. What do people get out of something like Galaxy Zoo? Why do people participate? They participate because they want to contribute to science. That's a characteristic of many kinds of what's called citizen science, where you engage lots and lots of citizens. They participate because they want to learn. That's one of their goals. They participate because they can discover things. There's one very famous case where some of the amateurs who were participating in Galaxy Zoo just because they wanted to for fun discovered a new kind of galaxy, and were actually included as authors on the formal paper. There's a community that develops in these kinds of projects. There's a very active discussion forum and listserv and discussion community, and that sense of community is there. Some people do it because they want to teach, not always. Some people do it for the beauty of science, the beauty of these images, the beauty of knowledge. Because they're dealing with galaxies, there's a vastness of the universe that applies, that people seem to be interested in. Just as they're interested in contributing to science, they're interested in anything where they feel like they're helping other people. That connection to other people is a big part of it. And then at the very bottom of the list is because they're interested in astronomy or science. And it's kind of interesting that that's at the bottom of the list. Right? They get involved in this project not because of the astronomy, but because of all of these other things. Similarly, people have looked at zoos, and what do people who feel like they've enjoyed zoos, maybe not learned, but there is at least that enjoyment and excitement, which is again part of the first strand. And that's been broken down into 4 different kinds of areas. It's not important to keep track of exactly them, except notice that they all involve social experience, or almost all. So the first group is the group that really enjoys doing something with their family. It's a social experience with their family. Yes, they enjoy seeing the animals up close, but as long as they were doing something with their family, they'd be happy. There's another group which is interested in again, doing things with their family, but again, it's not the animals that are important, it's the idea that they're learning, that they're investigating something new. That turns out to be what gives them enjoyment. There is a group that goes to the zoo because they like seeing animals. But not because a little bit because they want to learn about animals, but more because of some kind of emotional connection with animals. And finally, there's a group that's interested in the social experience with their friends. Not their family, but with friends. Notice that 3 out of these 4 groups that have been found when you study enjoyment in zoos involve, again, this social experience. So how can we apply that to hobbies? Hobbies, I think, count as serious leisure. Which I talked about a little bit earlier. If you try to understand who are the people who engage in hobbies, about 1/3 of them are people like me who like to collect things. There, the goal is mostly some kind of psychological satisfaction. It's not so much learning. When they've done studies of people who choose to engage in learning late in life by taking classes in their hobbies, almost 2/3 of those people, of the people who want to take some kind of class, it's a class that's related to their hobbies. More than half are looking for what they call knowledge-driven courses. These are things like learning a language or learning a new skill of some kind. And when they asked people what their goals were for engaging in this kind of learning tied to hobbies, part of it was personal satisfaction, but part of it was this idea of social network building. Connecting to the community was a big part of what was happening. It's probably worth saying a little bit at this point about the difference between amateurs and hobbyists. I haven't been making a sharp distinction there, but again, the literature on serious leisure does notice these distinctions. Amateurs are people who are doing something for fun. It's their avocation. They are motivated by seriousness and a sense of commitment. And we call them amateurs because they are somewhere between publics and professionals. One can be an amateur, but one could move on to be a professional in whatever it is that you're doing. And this contrasts with the idea of the hobbyist, who is also doing something specialized, which is also serious and committed, but there's usually no professional space to go on to. I have not yet found a profession of keychain collector. Both of them, both amateurs and hobbyists, have this idea of a work-like commitment. You're organized, you're disciplined, you want to be productive, you want to see something come out of what you're doing. Now, obviously, we can think about things like astronomers, amateur astronomers, as clearly fitting into the amateur category, because one could be a professional astronomer. Gardeners, there are very few professional gardeners, but it's a very different kind of space, perhaps more in the hobbyist space. How do people learn in hobbies? When people have tried to look at this, not surprisingly, they've come up with, it depends. There's many things that shape what people learn. Some of what they learn is they learn what the jargon calls a line of practice, an essence, a skill.
the thing that is specific to that, the knowledge that is specific to that field. Sometimes people learn things about themselves, about their goals, their beliefs, their values. Some of what they learn depends on what's called the conditions of practice, whether they even have the materials, let's say access to a telescope, right? It's harder to learn about the stars if you don't have access to a telescope or at least a pair of binoculars. You can learn something, but not as much. It depends on people's socioeconomic status, their social class, what kind of community they can connect to. Interestingly, one side note on this one is that there's been at least one study looking at the question of whether hobbies are the same in developing countries as in developed countries. And clearly some of these conditions of practice are relevant there. What else do people learn in hobbies? They take up the culture of the field, of the topic, the culture of astronomy, the culture of gardening. And they create social capital. They create greater connections within the community, a greater sense of resources, a greater sense of people in the community being able to rely on each other. And what you've seen is I keep coming back to this issue of social and social capital. And so I think it's worth our looking for a little bit at the sociological idea of social worlds, because hobbies have been described as social worlds. A social world is larger than just an individual group or organization. It's a network of groups. It's a group where you can people who are in the group can recognize other people in the group because they go to the same meetings, they belong to the same organizations, they do the same kinds of things, they find themselves involved in various kinds of activities. Typically, a social world does not have a central authority. It just exists, and there's nobody controlling what it looks like. The social world connects to itself by communicating with each other through magazines or meetings or things like that. It's usually not tied to any particular geographic territory. And while there may be organizations that you join, you don't have to join. There's no formal requirement to join to be part of the social world. It's cut off at the bottom there, but social worlds have been described as having 4 different stages. You can be a stranger to a social world. You can be a tourist to a social world. You come in and you test it. You just look to see what's happening. You can be a regular. You can be someone who's part of the social world on a regular basis. And then you can be an insider, someone who's really at the heart of that social world. Again, someone who perhaps makes it part of their identity. Another issue that thinking about social, and therefore collections of people, leads us to want to talk about is thinking about learning not just as an individual characteristic, but as something that happens in groups. It's well known that, for example, in science museums, part of what happens is there's family learning that takes place, where the learning is held within the family unit. Not every single individual in the family learns the same thing, but the family leaves with greater knowledge that they share with each other on a continuing basis. Some people who've looked at informal science learning have talked about community learning, particularly in places where there's perhaps an environmental problem and the community has to decide how to respond. And so a community may collectively gather knowledge. I think as an example, the maker community that I described, where there's this community of tinkerers who are all learning different things and sharing with each other and finding ways to record what they learn through websites and YouTube videos and so on. That's a form of this kind of communal learning. So now let me see if I can begin to tie all these threads of hobbies and recreation and learning and collective learning and culture together. So I think we need to think about this idea of cultural uptake. It's clearly what a lot of us are interested in when we talk about public communication of science or creating a culture of science, culture scientifique in French. It's creation of social capital and making science a part of the social capital that is available to our communities. Again, the panel we heard earlier on policy was addressing that tremendously, I think. Learning as being a form of tourism, as being something where people come into a field to explore it, and they may or may not stay, right? Out on the street there, right in front of the theater, there's a tourist information booth. Some of the people who stop there will come here to Zacatecas once, and some of them will come back again and again because they get taken by it. So what I think that means is that we can think about hobbies and recreation more generally as a form of science tourism, as a way in which people can come and explore science. And as an example, I want to look at a historical example of astronomy and the public in Mexico, which comes from the work of Susana Bureau. Is she here? I have not met her. I know sometimes she comes to these meetings. She's done a number of studies of popularization of astronomy in Mexico. And, it was actually while I was working on this talk that I found her work looking at Joaquin Gallo and some letters that were written to him when he was director of the National Astronomical Observatory in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And what she found was she was asking, how is science, these letters help us begin to understand how science was being appropriated by the public. It's one of the few ways where there were these self-generated letters. And what she observed was that looking at about 200 letters, they fell into three groups. One of the groups were people who were observing the sky. We would call them amateurs, maybe. They are people who had questions about what they were seeing, or they wanted confirmation that they had seen something, or they wanted instructions on how to observe the sky better. The second set she called poachers. These were people who were creating their own theories of the world, not many of which we would recognize as being real science. In fact, many of us have probably experienced these long-winded people who pull together ideas and words from many different places and tell us how they have proved that Einstein was wrong, or that Galileo was wrong, or Galileo, Kepler, Einstein, and every other scientist was wrong. They create their own theories. And some of these people were writing letters. And then there was a set she called the folklore people, the people who were relatively unlearned, did not have access to resources, and were writing because they somehow wanted to connect with science in some way. They saw science as a cultural force that they wanted to connect to, even if they didn't have a strong link between what they were talking about and what we would call science. And so I think this actually brings us back to that idea of social appropriation of science, which is a language, the apropiación social. It's a label which gets used only in Spanish. We don't use those kinds of that language in English, and I haven't heard it in other languages either. But I think it may capture a critical aspect of what's going on through recreation and hobbies. I think what we're seeing is that, if I come back to the title of recreation and PCST, we can see hobbies, which are a form of recreation, as a form of cultural tourism, coming into the science culture. Science is a culture, we all know that. Hobbies that involve science, recreation that involves science, brings people into the science culture. It provides a means for the social appropriation of science. If we think of that in terms of learning, We could say that by bringing people into science, whether we call them amateurs and hobbyists, whether we call them strangers, tourists, regulars, and insiders, whether we call them observers, poachers, and folklore, all of those are different ways in which these people are being brought into the science culture because it has these two elements of learning, the excitement and the motivation, and a sense of identity. What little we know about what people learn seems to point in that direction. Now, obviously, one of the things that many of us care about is whether this recreation is perhaps taking science itself more deeply into the public culture, so that people don't see science as something separate, but they see something as something that is just threaded through everyday life. We all know that. Public culture doesn't always recognize that. Again, I think this is actually easier to say in Spanish or French, culture scientifique or apropiación social. In those phrases, it seems to suggest that that it does work, that recreation is bringing science into public culture. It's harder for me to say that in English, and so I'm not sure quite how to answer the question. So, some conclusions. I think recreation does bring people to the science culture, probably initially as tourists. It's a way for them to test it out. If they get excited, it motivates them to learn more. Once they are regulars or insiders, they develop an identity as a science learner. They become serious hobbyists. And this implies that recreation does lead to science learning in a very deep way, not just specific content. You've noticed that in this talk I have talked very little about what, that someone who participates as an amateur astronomer learns more about astronomy. I've mentioned it, but I think far more important is for us to pay attention to this social community, to this social connection that hobbies and recreation more generally bring to people. Muchas gracias. Y